etaHEN 1.2 be released with Itemzflow. The problem was that if you were not connected to the internet, you had no network connection whatsoever on your PS5 because you're trying to, prevent updates, then Itemzflow would not work. It would just give you a black screen when you launched it because the way that Itemzflow and etaHEN communicated was through the network, through the local network on the PS5. But that's all been rewritten. The code for that has been rewritten so that now they communicate differently, essentially through like the process ID is used instead of having to, go through the network. So therefore, we now do not need a network connection in order to use Itemzflow with etaHEN. You can turn off the internet completely on the PS5. You can use a offline cache to access the exploit, and then you'll be able to still use Itemzflow while being offline. So that is a great option that has now been added. And we also have an opt-in option in etaHEN config to auto-launch Itemzflow. So in the data folder, in the etaHEN folder, and then config.ini, you can access that through FTP. And if you go in there, there is a config.ini file. Now this has existed since 1.2b, and inside the config.ini file, you've been able to do things like turn off the FTP server or PS5 debug. If you don't want those enabled, you can turn them off in the ini file, and then the next time you load at the payload, it will not launch the FTP server or the PS5 debug, depending on which ones you enable. But now there's also been an option added here to auto-launch Itemzflow. If you enable that option, it's not enabled by default, but if you enable that option in the config.ini file, then when you next launch etaHEN, it will automatically launch you into Itemzflow. Now, personally, I wouldn't really use this feature because, is it really that hard to just go over and launch Itemzflow from the home menu? And also, a lot of the times that I'm launching etaHEN, I'm not necessarily using Itemzflow. This is more for people who want to use Itemzflow to kind of replace the normal XMB, where you pretty much just use Itemzflow as your main launcher for your games and stuff. So that's for people who kind of want to use Itemzflow like that. You can enable this feature so it automatically launches it as soon as you run the payload. We also have added support for resuming apps and games from rest mode. This is something that wasn't working previously, so you can now put your console into rest mode and recover from rest mode in etaHEN, and everything should still work, and resuming your games. Also, improved keylog server to improve the kernel log server, so you can run it with netcat using the PS5's IP and port 9081, or you can use PuTTY, like I would normally use PuTTY and telnet on port 9081 to get the debug log, the kernel log. So that's now available as well. Now, in addition to that, we also have a complementary release of Itemzflow to go along with this. So a new build of Itemzflow has been updated to version 1.04. It adds support for firmware 3.xx, of course, so people on 3.xx firmwares can now access Itemzflow, can now use it, render game backups. It's also fixed an issue where changing directory would never go away. That's one bug I did hear quite a few people mention, that when they selected the game dump folder in the PS5 app section, it would get stuck sometimes on changing directory and it would never finish. So that's been fixed. Also, Itemzflow will now install the Kstuff database triggers only for 3.xx on launch. So this is something that would cause out-of-memory errors, I think, on 3.xx, but it's beneficial for people on 4.xx firmwares. It's just a difference between, I think, the way the database works with 4.xx firmwares versus 3.xx firmwares. So now it's basically optimized so that people on 4.xx firmwares can still benefit from it, but people on 3.xx firmwares, it will only happen on launch so that you don't get out-of-memory errors on 3.xx firmwares. Another big one is that the Itemzflow PS5 app database has been moved to data Itemzflow PS5_apps database from the app folder. So previously, the database was on the app folder for the actual application. So for Itemzflow, it was in user app and then item 0001. And the problem with that is that you would lose your virtual apps when you reinstall the application. So if you deleted Itemzflow and reinstalled it, it would get rid of that database file when you deleted it. Then reinstalling it would recreate the database again, a blank version basically, so you would lose your virtual apps. That was one issue, whereas with this, if it's in the data folder, it's kind of separated from all of the apps. So no matter how much you reinstall anything, it's not going to affect the database. The database will stay there, which is what you want. So that is Andy. That's now being moved to a kind of better location for that database to be. However, what's important now is that if you don't want to lose your virtual apps when you install this new version of Itemzflow, you'll need to connect through FTP and go to the user app items 001 folder before you uninstall the old Itemzflow application. You'll need to go to that location and copy the database file that's in there to the data folder, to data/Itemzflow. If that location doesn't exist, create it in the data folder and copy the app file in there. I'll be showing on screen exactly how to do that right here. And then that way, once you've copied that database file from the app folder to the data folder, you can then delete Itemzflow version 1.03 and then install the new build 1.04, and your virtual apps should remain. Also, he's rewritten all IPC commands to be networkless, which again just harpers back to the same thing from etaHEN 1.3b, so does not require a network connection. Also fixed an issue where installing packages from the data folder would give an error. So yes, you can use the package installer that's built into Itemzflow to install package files not just from a USB, but from any location on the hard drive. Usually the data folder is where you would put them, where you can write the package files to the data folder. So if you wanted to do remote package installing, one way you can do it is just to use FTP to copy package files to the data folder and then use the package installer in Itemzflow, select that package file in the data folder and install it. Previously that would cause an error, but now they can be installed. So that works now. Also, a word on the PS5 compatibility list, it's only games that can work up firmware 5.0. There are some people who seem to not know this. I thought I've been pretty clear about this in the past, but I just wanted to reaffirm this so that people realize, so that there's not any confusion, is that essentially the games that we can run right now, the PS5 game dumps, are only game dumps that work up to the release of pretty much 5.0. So any games that are runnable on 4.51 up until the release of when 5.0 came out, and then we started getting new games that required, a higher SDK version. At that point, you can't run any of those games because those require a new game update that requires a higher firmware for you to be on in order to install and run these games. Now, the reason why we can play PS4 fake packages that work up to the latest game releases, like Assassin's Creed Mirage, can be played on the PS5, the reason why that's possible is because CYB1K, the person who creates the backports, he has access to keys that are able to decrypt those games, which we don't have access to on the PS5 for PS5 games. So PS5 games are limited. We can only run game backups that are playable on the firmwares that we have jailbreaks for, which is 4.51 is the highest. So any games that came out when 4.51 was released up to when 5.0 was released. So it pretty much stops around April 2022. So any games that came out from April 2022 and earlier are games that we can dump and we can try and run on Itemzflow on our jailbroken PS5s. But any games that came out after that date are not going to be playable unless we get access to the decryption keys necessary to decrypt those games, which we don't have access to right now. So that's the situation we're in right now. So this is why when we're talking about backports, we're talking about backporting games that will run on, say, 4.51, but will not run on 3.0 because 3.0 is too old of a firmware. We could backport that game because we can dump it. Somebody on 4.51 can dump it on their console, and then we could backport it to run on 3.0 so people on those firmwares can access those newer games. That's what we're talking about. You cannot run your backport games that require higher firmwares than whatever the highest jailbreakable firmware is at the time, which right now is 4.51. So that's the situation we're in right now. It even goes to game updates as well, because there are game updates that you can run on 4.51 that are too high to run on 3.0, and those could be backported so that people on 3.0 could run those higher game updates. Even on 4.03, there are some game updates that are runnable on 4.51 that are not on 4.03. Those don't require as much backporting because 4.3 and 4.51 are similar enough that it doesn't require much. Sometimes just changing the SDK version or whatever will fix it, but the 3.x firmwares compared to 4.x firmwares are quite a bit different and require a lot more work backporting games, so it will take a while before a lot of these games that normally require higher firmwares than 3.0 are actually then runnable on 3.0 once they get backported. So it'll take a little bit of time for those to get backported to work on those older firmwares. So anyway, that's it for this update. Hope you guys enjoyed it and found the information